The unspoken temptation. My husband asked me to grab the stick of his two friends. I could not handle it anymore. Welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories. My name is Sophie, I'm 35, and I live in Boston, a bustling city where life moves fast. I've been married for 10 years to Mark, who's 46. We both work at the same auto parts store, where I handle the administrative side while he manages the place. Our love story began the day we both got hired. It was instant, passion, attraction, everything. We were inseparable, and within a short time we got married. But as the years passed, our love life started to change, especially on Mark's end. As time wore on, Mark grew more comfortable with the familiar rhythms of life, perhaps too comfortable. His nights of beer and heavy food began to take a toll on his body. I, on the other hand, always valued maintaining my appearance, especially as I approached my 40s. My last Christmas gift to myself was a silicone implant paid for by Mark, as my salary wasn't enough to cover such luxuries. Mark, always generous, wanted the best for me, even though his body was following a different path. Over the years, Mark's body grew heavier. He went from fit to an alarming 130 kilo, and this impacted our intimacy. Our once passionate encounters became rare, frustrating, and unsatisfying. Each time we tried, Mark was out of breath within minutes, sweating and needing to pause for air. I felt the distance growing, not just physically, but emotionally. I loved him deeply, but something was missing. One night, after another failed attempt at intimacy, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I sat down next to Mark and with a heavy heart told him, "We need to do something about your weight. I'm worried about your health." Though I truly cared about his well-being, what pained me more was the emotional void growing between us. I missed being desired, feeling wanted, feeling that fire. Mark listened, and for a few weeks he made an effort to lose weight, but it didn't last. His dislike for physical activity and routine soon took over, and he gave up. The thought of leaving him never crossed my mind because, despite everything, I loved him. But I couldn't ignore the void in our intimacy. I tried to cope, even attempted to satisfy myself in other ways, but nothing filled the emptiness I felt. I craved that fiery passion again, the kind we used to have, but it was gone. Then came that fateful night, 5 months ago in March. Mark had organized a night out with two of his clients, Celso and Ricardo, both owners of auto repair shops in town. It wasn't unusual for me to tag along on these outings. Mark enjoyed my company, and I often liked to socialize. That night, I dressed up. Nothing too over the top, but enough to make me feel good about myself. I wore a tight, short black dress and did my makeup. Mark noticed and, with a smile, teased me. "And oh wonder I can't keep up with you. Look at how stunning you are." I laughed, replying in a playful tone, "Well, if I'm too much for you, maybe you should share me with your friends." It was a light-hearted joke, or at least it was meant to be. But Mark surprised me when he responded with a grin, "Pick which one, and I'll make it happen." It was one of those offhand comments married couples make, meant to be harmless, but it struck something inside me. Maybe it was the lack of passion at home, or maybe it was something deeper, but after that exchange my mind began wandering. I found myself thinking of other men, fantasizing even. When we arrived at the bar, the place was buzzing with life. Tables of men playing pool, the scent of fried food in the air, and the sounds of clinking beer bottles. Celso arrived first. He greeted us with his usual charm and, like always, poked fun at Mark. "Man, you must have kidnapped this woman because she's way out of your league." Celso joked, his eyes lingering on me longer than they should have. I smiled politely, ignoring the tension I could feel creeping into the night. Soon after, Ricardo arrived, and when I saw him, I felt something shift inside me. He was tall, dark, and impeccably put together. His presence was magnetic. He approached me and, with a confident smile, asked if he could sit beside me. I nodded, suddenly aware of the fluttering in my chest. As the evening wore on, Celso and Mark became engrossed in their pool game, leaving Ricardo and me to chat. What began as light conversation soon grew more personal. He told me about his failed relationship, how his ex had no interest in intimacy or fun. I sympathized, perhaps too much. His frustration mirrored my own. I found myself laughing at his jokes, sharing bits of my own life, and feeling a connection I hadn't expected. Then, as the alcohol loosened our inhibitions, the conversation turned more playful. I teased him, saying Mark should let him take me out for a spin. To my surprise, Ricardo didn't shy away from the flirtation. With a grin, he leaned in and asked, "If I close the deal with Mark, will I get a kiss as a bonus?" I laughed it off at first, but the tension between us was undeniable. Moments later, Ricardo excused himself to get something from his car. He gave me a look that said more than words ever could. My heart raced as I followed him outside, away from the bar's noise and into the cool night air. The temptation was too much to resist. In the shadows of a nearby alley, Ricardo pulled me close, and what began as a kiss quickly spiraled into something far more intense. The thrill of the forbidden surged through me. For the first time in years, I felt desired, alive. When it was over, I was breathless, trembling with a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. Ricardo and I returned to the bar, acting as if nothing had happened. Later that night, as Mark drove us home, he asked me how I convinced Ricardo to sign the deal. I smiled and told him I just explained how it would benefit him. But deep down, I knew the truth was much more complicated. What happened with Ricardo opened a door inside me, a door to desires I hadn't realized were still there. And now, I'm standing at a crossroads, torn between my love for Mark and the intoxicating thrill of what I'd experienced with Ricardo. Days passed after that night with Ricardo, but the memory lingered. I tried to push it out of my mind, to bury it beneath the routine of everyday life, but it kept resurfacing like an itch I couldn't scratch. Mark, blissfully unaware of what had transpired, was in great spirits after closing the deal. The bonus from the sale would fund our dream vacation, and he kept talking about all the places we could visit. Yet, as he spoke about our plans, I found myself zoning out, my thoughts drifting back to that alley, to Ricardo's touch, to the feelings I hadn't experienced in so long. It wasn't just the physical connection, it was the sense of being desired, of breaking the rules, of doing something for myself. That thrill had awoken something inside me, something I couldn't ignore. One evening, as Mark and I sat at home watching TV, he looked over at me and smiled. "You've seemed happier lately," he said, reaching for my hand. "I'm glad we're doing better. I've missed this." His words cut through me like a knife. How could I tell him that what I was feeling had nothing to do with him, that the spark he thought was returning had come from another man? I smiled back, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Yeah, me too," I lied. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between Mark and me began to grow again, despite his best efforts. He'd started trying harder, planning date nights, making small gestures to rekindle the passion between us, but it wasn't enough. The weight of what had happened with Ricardo and my growing desire for more of that excitement hung over me like a shadow. Then, one afternoon while I was at work, I received a text message from an unknown number. My heart skipped a beat when I opened it. "It's Ricardo. I haven't stopped thinking about you." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Part of me knew I should ignore it, delete it, and move on. But another part of me, the part that had been awakened that night in the alley, wanted more. I hesitated for a moment, then typed back, "I can't stop thinking about it either." The exchange opened a floodgate of emotions I hadn't realized were so close to the surface. Over the next few weeks, Ricardo and I began texting more often, at first just casual conversation, but it quickly became flirtatious. He'd ask how my day was, then slip in a comment about how he couldn't wait to see me again. Every message from him sent a thrill through my body, a reminder of the connection we shared that night. I told myself it was harmless, just a bit of fun. But deep down, I knew I was playing with fire. Then came the day he asked to meet again. It was a Friday afternoon, and Mark was scheduled to work late. Ricardo suggested we grab a drink, just the two of us. My heart raced as I read his message. I knew what meeting him again would mean, knew the line I was about to cross. But the thought of seeing him, of feeling that rush again, was too tempting to resist. I agreed. That evening, I dressed carefully, choosing something that looked casual but still accentuated my curves. I told Mark I was meeting a friend for drinks after work, and he didn't question it. As I left the house, guilt gnawed at me, but excitement drowned it out. I met Ricardo at a quiet bar on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. He was already there when I arrived, leaning against the bar, a confident smile on his face. The moment our eyes met, the tension between us was undeniable. We sat down, ordered drinks, and for a while we just talked. But beneath the surface, I could feel the pull between us growing stronger with every passing minute. My heart raced as he leaned in closer, his hand grazing mine as he spoke. And then, without warning, he leaned in and kissed me. It was like a match being struck, igniting something inside me that I could no longer control. The kiss was hungry, desperate, like we were both trying to reclaim that night in the alley. We didn't talk about consequences. We didn't talk about what this meant for our respective lives. In that moment, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the fire between us, the way he made me feel alive again. The evening blurred by in a haze of passion and stolen moments. After we left the bar, we found ourselves in his car, parked in a secluded spot. The air was thick with desire, and before I knew it, we were tangled in each other once again, just like that first night. It was raw, reckless, and exhilarating. But as the night wore on, reality began to creep back in. When it was over, I sat there, my heart pounding, my mind spinning. What was I doing? I was risking everything, my marriage, my life, for what? For a momentary thrill? As I pulled away from Ricardo that night, the weight of my actions began to sink in. I knew I couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep living a double life. But the problem was, now that I'd tasted this new side of myself, I didn't know how to stop. Back at home, Mark was waiting for me. He was sitting on the couch, watching TV, just like every other night. When I walked in, he looked up and smiled, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. "How was your night?" he asked, oblivious to the guilt that was eating away at me. "It was fine," I replied, forcing a smile. As I sat down beside him, the weight of my secrets felt heavier than ever. I loved Mark, at least I thought I did. But I also knew that something had shifted inside me, something I couldn't ignore. Now, every time I looked at my husband, I felt a strange mix of love, guilt, and longing. I didn't want to hurt him, didn't want to destroy the life we had built together. But the thrill of what I'd experienced with Ricardo was intoxicating, and I didn't know if I could give it up. I was trapped between two worlds, the safe, comfortable life I'd always known with Mark, and the wild, exhilarating world that Ricardo had opened up for me. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more I realized I couldn't have both. The days that followed were agonizing. Each time I looked at Mark, the guilt gnawed at me, but at the same time, the memory of that night with Ricardo haunted me. It wasn't just the physical aspect, it was the way he made me feel. Alive, seen, wanted. With Mark, I had security, love, stability, but with Ricardo, I had passion, and that fire had rekindled something deep inside of me. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on my life with Mark, but it was like fighting an invisible force. At work, I'd find myself checking my phone constantly, hoping to see Ricardo's name light up the screen. When it did, my heart would leap, even though I knew I was on dangerous ground. Then, one afternoon, while I was at work, my phone buzzed again. "Let's meet again, I can't stop thinking about you." I stared at the message, my mind swirling. I knew I should say no. I knew I was treading on dangerous territory. But instead, my fingers moved on their own, and before I could stop myself, I replied, "Where and when?" That evening, I told Mark I had to stay late at work, finishing up some reports. He didn't question it, just nodded and kissed me goodbye. Guilt washed over me as I left the house, but the excitement bubbling underneath drowned it out. I knew what I was about to do was wrong, yet I couldn't stop myself. Ricardo had chosen a small hotel outside the city, away from prying eyes. When I arrived, he was already waiting for me in the lobby. The moment I saw him, the pull between us was undeniable. He didn't say a word, just took my hand and led me upstairs to the room. What happened next was inevitable. The moment the door closed behind us, we were in each other's arms, our bodies moving with the same urgency and hunger we'd felt before. It was passionate, intense, and completely reckless. In that room, everything else melted away. Mark, my marriage, my life. It was just Ricardo and me, two people giving in to their most primal desires. Afterward, as we lay tangled together in the bed, reality slowly began to creep back in. I stared at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. What had I done? Again? Ricardo lay beside me, his breathing heavy, his hand resting on my stomach. He looked over at me, his eyes dark and filled with something I couldn't quite place. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. I turned to face him, unsure of how to answer. What was I thinking about? My husband at home, clueless to what I'd been doing. The guilt that was gnawing at me, threatening to tear me apart, or the fact that, despite everything, I didn't want this to end. "I don't know," I finally whispered, more to myself than to him. Ricardo sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I know this is complicated," he said after a long pause, "but I can't help how I feel about you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was he confessing something deeper than just a fleeting attraction? And more importantly, what did I feel for him? This wasn't just a casual fling anymore. I was emotionally entangled, and that scared me. I didn't respond, too overwhelmed by the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Instead, I gathered my clothes, slipping into them quickly. Ricardo watched me silently, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "I should go," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. "Sophie." His voice was soft, almost pleading. But I couldn't stay, I couldn't let myself fall deeper into this mess. Without another word, I grabbed my bag and left the room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove home, the weight of what I'd done crashed down on me. I had crossed a line and I wasn't sure I could ever come back from it. My phone buzzed again, Ricardo's name lighting up the screen. But I didn't have the strength to answer. I knew I was spiraling out of control, and I had no idea how to stop. When I arrived home, Mark was sitting on the couch watching TV. He smiled when he saw me, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I mumbled a greeting and headed straight for the shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the guilt that clung to my skin. As the water poured over me, tears welled up in my eyes. What was I doing? I loved Mark, didn't I? He had been nothing but good to me, supportive, caring, loving. But with Ricardo, it was like I had been awakened to something I didn't even know I needed. And now I was trapped between two worlds, unsure of which one I belonged to. In the days that followed, I tried to distance myself from Ricardo. I stopped replying to his messages, ignored his calls. But it wasn't easy. The temptation was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for a moment of weakness. Mark, meanwhile, seemed happier than ever. He was making more of an effort, planning romantic evenings, talking about our upcoming vacation. I should have been happy. I should have felt content. But instead, I felt suffocated by the weight of my secrets. Then, one evening, everything came crashing down. Mark and I were out to dinner, celebrating the deal he had closed with Ricardo. We were seated at a cozy corner table, enjoying a bottle of wine. For the first time in weeks, I had started to feel like maybe things could go back to normal. That maybe I could put everything behind me. But as we were finishing dessert, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and then looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Ricardo just messaged me," he said slowly. "He says he needs to talk to me about something important." My heart skipped a beat, panic surging through me. What could Ricardo possibly want to talk to Mark about? Did he know? Was he going to tell him about what had happened between us? I forced a smile, trying to mask my fear. "I'm sure it's just business," I said, my voice wavering. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew that Ricardo held a power over me now, a power that could destroy everything. And as Mark made arrangements to meet with him the next day, I felt my entire world beginning to unravel. The next day dragged on like an eternity. I could barely focus at work, knowing that Mark was meeting Ricardo later that afternoon. My mind raced with endless possibilities. Had Ricardo said something? Was he going to? Why did he need to talk to Mark in the first place? Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt into my throat, half expecting it to be Mark, or worse, Ricardo. By the time I got home, I was a bundle of nerves. Mark was supposed to be home any minute, and I had no idea how that conversation had gone. I replayed 1,000 scenarios in my head, each one worse than the last. But when Mark finally walked through the door, he looked calm, almost cheerful. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and went to hang up his jacket, as if nothing was amiss. "How was your meeting with Ricardo?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled slightly. Mark glanced at me as he sat down at the kitchen table. "It went well. We talked about the business. He has some ideas for the future, nothing urgent, but it was good to touch base." Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by guilt. Ricardo hadn't said anything. He had kept our secret, for now. But I knew it couldn't stay hidden forever. The weight of it was suffocating me. I tried to throw myself back into my marriage, to focus on Mark, on the life we had built together. But it was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Every attempt to reignite the passion we once had only reminded me of what was missing. And each time I looked at my phone, my fingers itched to send a message to Ricardo, to fall back into that intoxicating web we had woven. It was around that time that the dreams started. At night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, vivid images of Ricardo's touch haunting me. In my dreams, I was always in that alley with him, reliving that first stolen moment of passion. But sometimes, Mark was there too, watching, judging, his face a mask of betrayal. The guilt was eating me alive. I couldn't continue living this double life, but I didn't know how to stop. Ricardo's messages became less frequent, but they never stopped completely. Every now and then, a text would appear out of the blue, reigniting the flames I had tried so hard to extinguish. "Miss you. Can't stop thinking about you." Each time, I would stare at the message for hours, torn between the life I had with Mark and the thrill I had experienced with Ricardo. I never responded, but the desire lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. One evening, Mark and I were having dinner at home, a quiet meal in front of the TV. He was telling me about some new clients he had lined up, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could make this work. Maybe with time, the fire between us would return. But then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his face darkened. "What's wrong?" I asked, suddenly feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "It's Ricardo," Mark muttered, his voice low. The room seemed to close in around me. I could feel my pulse quicken, my palms growing sweaty. "What did he say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark stared at the screen for a moment before tossing his phone onto the table. "He says he wants to talk again. He's been acting weird lately. I don't know what's going on with him." My heart was pounding in my chest, panic rising like a tidal wave. I had to do something. If Ricardo kept pushing, kept wanting to see Mark, the truth would come out eventually. I couldn't let that happen. That night, while Mark slept, I slipped out of bed and went into the living room. I picked up my phone, my fingers trembling as I opened my messages. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it made my stomach churn. "We can't keep doing this," I typed, my hands shaking. "This has to stop. Please don't contact Mark anymore." I hesitated for a moment, then hit send. The message was delivered, and the silence that followed felt like a heavy weight pressing down on me. For a few days, I heard nothing. Mark didn't mention Ricardo again, and I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, this was over. But then, a week later, I received a reply. "Meet me one last time. We need to talk." My heart sank. I knew I should ignore it, delete the message and never look back. But I also knew that I owed it to myself and to Mark to end this once and for all. I couldn't live with the uncertainty, the fear that Ricardo would one day decide to expose everything. I had to face him. I agreed to meet him that evening at the same hotel we had gone to before. It felt like a fitting place for things to end, where it had all started spiraling out of control. As I arrived, my hands were shaking, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Ricardo was already there, waiting in the dimly lit lobby. When he saw me, he smiled, but there was something different in his eyes, something colder, more calculating. We went up to the room, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. When we entered, I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "This has to end," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "I can't keep doing this." Ricardo didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me, his eyes unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't want it to end," he said quietly, his voice laced with something darker. "But I guess I don't have a choice, do I?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "It's not fair to Mark. It's not fair to any of us." Ricardo's expression hardened, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of fear. "Fair?" he repeated, his voice cold. "Do you think any of this has been fair to me? You get to have your perfect life with your husband, and I'm just supposed to walk away?" I took a step back, suddenly feeling cornered. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Ricardo interrupted, his voice rising. "You think you can just play with people's lives and walk away? Do you think I'll let you?" My blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" Ricardo took a step toward me, his eyes narrowing. "I'm saying that if you don't give me what I want, maybe Mark should know the truth." Panic surged through me. I hadn't expected this, hadn't realized how deep Ricardo's feelings for me had gone. He wasn't just looking for closure, he wanted control, leverage over me. "You wouldn't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Wouldn't I?" He shot back. "Think about it, Sophie. What's stopping me from telling him everything?" Fear gripped me, squeezing my chest like a vice. Ricardo was dangerous now, a threat I hadn't seen coming. I needed to get out of there, to figure out a way to stop him before everything I had worked for came crashing down around me. "I'll give you time to think about it," Ricardo said, stepping back, his voice cool and calculated. "But don't wait too long." Without another word, I turned and fled the room, my heart pounding in my ears. As I drove home, tears streamed down my face. I was trapped, caught in a web of my own making, and I didn't know how to escape. Back at home, Mark was asleep, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface of our lives. I stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. How had I let things get this far? How had I let my life spiral so completely out of control? But there was no time for self-pity. I had to act, and fast, before Ricardo could follow through on his threat. The next few days were torture. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart skipped a beat. Every time Mark asked me a question or made a comment, I was terrified that he knew. Ricardo's threat hung over me like a dark cloud, and I couldn't escape the fear that at any moment my world would come crashing down. But I couldn't let that happen. I had to think of a plan, something to keep Ricardo quiet, something that would protect the life I had built with Mark. I knew the truth would destroy everything, and I wasn't ready to lose it all. The love I had for Mark, despite everything, was real. I had made a terrible mistake, but I couldn't let it define the rest of my life. The following week, Ricardo texted me again. "Have you thought about what I said?" I didn't want to reply, didn't want to feed into the twisted game he was playing, but ignoring him wasn't an option. I had to face this, had to find a way to neutralize the threat before it was too late. I took a deep breath and responded, "I'll meet you tonight, but this has to be the last time." He agreed, and my heart sank as I realized what I had to do. I couldn't play along with his manipulations any longer. I needed to confront him once and for all, to put an end to the power he held over me. That night, I told Mark I was going to visit a friend and left the house. My hands shook as I drove to the hotel, the same place we had met before. Every fibre of my being screamed for me to turn around, to forget the whole thing, but I knew I couldn't run from this any longer. When I arrived, Ricardo was waiting in the lobby, just as he had before. His smile was casual, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made my skin crawl. Without a word, he led me up to the room. As soon as the door closed behind us, I turned to face him. "This ends tonight, Ricardo," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "You're not going to blackmail me. You're not going to ruin my life." He raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "And how do you plan to stop me?" My stomach churned, but I didn't let the fear show. "Because I'm telling Mark tonight. I'm going to confess everything." Ricardo's smirk faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You wouldn't," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. "I would," I said, my voice steady. "I'd rather him hear it from me than from you. You think you can control me, but you can't. You don't have any real power over me." Ricardo's expression darkened. "You're bluffing." "I'm not," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. "This ends now. If you say anything, it won't matter. Mark will know the truth, and you'll be the one who looks pathetic, trying to use our mistake to manipulate me." For a long moment, Ricardo just stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold and calculating. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out if I was telling the truth. But I held my ground, refusing to let him see the fear gnawing at my insides. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Go ahead and ruin your life. I don't care anymore." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and left the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back as I walked out of the hotel and got into my car. I had done it. I had faced Ricardo, stood up to him and taken back control of my life. But now I had to face the hardest part, telling Mark the truth. The drive home was a blur. I rehearsed the conversation over and over in my head, trying to find the right words, the words that would somehow make this easier. But there were no right words for this. I had betrayed him, and nothing I said could change that. When I arrived home, Mark was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of him. He looked up as I walked in, his expression soft, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, how was your evening?" he asked casually, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. I stood there for a moment, my heart heavy with guilt. Then, taking a deep breath, I sat down across from him. "Mark," I said quietly, my voice trembling, "I need to tell you something." He frowned, setting his glass down. "What is it?" My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't find the words. But then I forced myself to speak, to say the words I had been dreading. "I made a mistake," I whispered. I've been seeing someone else." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark just stared at me, his face a mask of confusion, as if he couldn't quite process what I had just said. "What?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "It was with Ricardo," I confessed, my voice shaking. "It happened after that night we went out with him and Celso. I don't know why, but it happened, and I'm so sorry." Mark didn't speak. He just sat there staring at me, the colour draining from his face. The silence stretched on, suffocating me, until finally he stood up, his hands trembling. "How long?" he asked, his voice hollow. "A few times," I whispered, the shame crashing down over me like a tidal wave. "But I ended it. I swear it's over." Mark ran a hand through his hair, pacing the kitchen, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Why would you do this?" "I don't know," I sobbed, my chest heaving with the weight of my guilt. I was lonely. I felt like we were drifting apart, and I made a mistake. A terrible, horrible mistake. For a long moment, Mark didn't say anything. He just stood there, his back to me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Finally, he turned to face me, his eyes filled with pain, betrayal etched into every line of his face. "I trusted you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought we were in this together." "We are," I pleaded, standing up and reaching for him. "Mark, please, I love you. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can—" "Stop," he interrupted, pulling away from me. "Just stop." The finality in his voice shattered me. I watched as he walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and out of my life. I stood there alone, the weight of my actions crashing down on me. There was no escaping the truth now. I had destroyed everything, my marriage, my life, my future. And for what? A fleeting moment of excitement, a desire that had burned too bright and left me with nothing but ashes. The house was silent, empty. The life I had once known was gone, and all that was left was the wreckage of my choices. I had gambled everything, and in the end, I had lost. Before you leave, remember to subscribe to the channel by activating the Tinkerbell to receive notification every time.